The sound came just as Henry Maddox lifted the coffee to his
We
lips.
are not their
At
mothers.
first, he thought it was the wind,
We are ghosts.
one of those sharp little whistles that slip through the sagebrush out here on Highway 26. But then it came again, faint, thin, and wrong. It didn't ride the air like a breeze. It clung to it. A high-pitched cry. Almost a whimper. He froze. 74 years old, knees that ached in the cold, a hip that clicked from an old combat injury. But still, every nerve in his body sharpened as if he were back in the motor pool in Kandahar, listening for trouble in the static. He tilted his head. Stillness. Then, there, the sound came again, barely audible beneath the hiss of wind through gravel. Henry set his paper cup on the hood of his truck, his worn flannel jacket catching in the rising gust. The rest stop was quiet. Too quiet. Just past dawn, with no other cars in the lot, and the last semi he'd seen was 20 miles back. He scanned the edge of the area. Cracked pavement giving way to dry scrub. An old picnic bench half-eaten by termites. And beyond that, the roots of a twisted juniper tree clawing through a slope of loose dirt and sage. He took a step, and another. He didn't know what he expected. A hurt dog? A trapped jackrabbit? He'd seen plenty of roadkill in his life, but this sound wasn't roadkill. This sound was asking. He rounded the bend, boots crunching softly, and saw them. Tucked into a hollow beneath the gnarled roots were two small shapes. Pressed so tightly against each other, they looked like one. He squinted. Spotted fur, ears too big for their heads, eyes barely open. Bobcats. Kittens. His breath caught. They were still, not sleeping. Too still for that. Shivering but otherwise lifeless. One of them made a feeble attempt at a sound, that same high, broken chirp. Then its head drooped again. Henry stood frozen, unsure of what to do with the impossible scene in front of him. They were babies, wild alone. The cold wrapped around his ankles like fog. It was barely 40 degrees out, and those kittens had no fat, no cover. Just skin, bone, and the last ghost of body heat. It was a miracle they weren't already dead. He looked around. Nothing. No sign of the mother, no tracks, no blood. Just the silence of a bad decision made days ago by a desperate adult bobcat. Maybe one driven too close to the highway by hunger, trash, or development. Henry felt something move inside him. Not pity, not fear, obligation. He knelt slowly, one creaking joint at a time, and pulled off his heavy denim jacket. The fleece lining was warm from his drive. He spread it flat beside the hollow, hands careful and deliberate. The kittens didn't flinch. One had its eyes open, dull blue, unfocused. But it didn't react to his presence at all. It weighed nothing. Like a puff of fur wrapped around twigs. The second was worse, colder, bonier. He tucked them both into the inside of the jacket, wrapped it snug around them, then zipped the front halfway to hold them close. Their bodies pressed against his chest. And for the first time, he felt it, a flutter. Not a heartbeat, not exactly, more like a vibration. The barest hum of life. It was enough. Back at the truck, Henry cranked the heat and gently set the bundle on the passenger seat. His phone was old, but the search worked. Wild animal rescue near me. Blue Basin Wildlife Center, emergency wildlife intake. 89 miles. He looked over at the tiny bulge in the jacket beside him, then put the truck in gear. The drive blurred. He didn't remember the trees or the turns. Only the feeling of checking that bundle every few minutes. Reaching over, careful, gloved fingers brushing against fur, hoping for movement. When he finally pulled off the rural highway and onto the dirt road leading to the center, the sun was high, the desert bright and blinding. The place looked unremarkable. A low building with a green roof, barely taller than the surrounding brush. A woman in rubber boots and a brown beanie met him halfway down the path. "You Maddox?" she asked. already peering toward the bundle in his arms. He nodded. 2 kittens. Found 'em under a tree at a rest stop. Cold as stone. She didn't say anything. Just took the bundle, turned on her heel, and strode toward the building with a speed that belied her size. Inside, Henry was hit by warmth. Heat lamps, disinfectant, the faint smell of wet straw and latex gloves. A flurry of movement. A young man pulled on gloves. Another staffer was prepping a machine. The woman set the jacket on a stainless steel table and opened it. The room went quiet. Henry watched as they gently lifted the kittens out, laying them on a soft towel under an incubator light. "They're critical," the woman said without looking up, "but not gone." She glanced up. "I'm Dr. Mira Tran. Thank you for bringing them." Henry nodded again. "You think they'll make it?" Mira paused. "They've got a chance. That's more than they had yesterday." He nodded once and looked at the kittens again. Their chests rose and fell, shallow, uneven, but they were breathing. They were alive, and for the first time in a long time, Henry felt the tightness in his chest ease. Just a little. In the hours that followed, Henry Maddox found himself sitting in a corner of the Wildlife Center's intake room, watching a kind of quiet urgency he hadn't seen since his Army days. Not chaos, not panic. Discipline. Everyone moved like they knew exactly what to do. Because they did. The air hummed with soft instructions, beeping monitors, the hiss of a sterilizer, and the low whoosh of an overhead heater set to full blast. The place smelled faintly of iodine, warmed milk, and something else. Life hanging on by a thread. At the center of it all were 2 shivering bundles of fur, barely bigger than a pair of gloves, resting on a folded fleece towel inside a plastic incubator. Their eyes were open now, but glassy. Neither one made a sound. Dr. Mira Tran hovered over them with gloved hands, flanked by 2 assistants, a tall, freckled young man named Micah and a quiet woman with sharp eyes named Renee. "She's only 91.6, Mira said, checking the thermometer again. "We've got to bring her up slow." Micah nodded and prepped the IV. Renee was already setting out subcutaneous fluids. Every motion was precise, deliberate, unspoken. No one raised their voice. No one panicked. Even the most fragile lives were handled like they still had fight in them. Because until proven otherwise, they did. Henry watched silently from behind a yellow tape line. He wasn't technically supposed to be in there. But when he'd tried to leave, Mira had given him a look and said, "You're not in the way. Yet." So he stayed. They began by stabilizing the kittens' body temperatures. A small warming disc was slid beneath the fleece, and warm air was piped into the incubator chamber to bring the ambient temp to 95 degrees F. Mira adjusted a dial with her pinky, never taking her eyes off the monitors. Micah injected the sub-Q fluids, a slow, warm saline solution into the loose skin between each kitten's shoulders. Henry flinched slightly the first time. But the kittens didn't even stir. "No reaction," Mira murmured. "They're near the edge." Renee returned with a flea comb and a small bowl of soapy water. "You want me to start?" "Yeah. Be gentle. No chemical dips yet. We don't want to shock their systems." The combing took nearly an hour. Flea after flea was drowned with ruthless efficiency. Tiny brown ticks were lifted with forceps and dropped into a vial for later analysis. Henry watched them fall like black rain. Then came the milk, but not from a bottle. "They're too weak to suckle," Mira explained to no one in particular, "so we tube feed." Micah slid a thin feeding tube down the throat of the stronger kitten, the one they'd tagged as Echo 17, then measured it against her side to ensure it reached the stomach and not the lungs. It was delicate work. One mistake, and the kitten could aspirate and die within hours. "Any movement?" Mira asked. Micah looked closely. "Tongue twitch, maybe recognition." "Good, let's try 3 ml. The formula was a specially mixed solution, warmed to exactly 101.5 degrees. It smelled faintly sweet. Powdered goat milk, nutrients, feline probiotics. As it slid into the kitten's body, Mira rested one finger lightly on the chest. "Heartbeat stable," she said softly. "We might have got her just in time." The second kitten, tagged as Flint 18, was even weaker. Mira handled her herself. No feeding yet, just fluids and warmth. Her belly was sunken, and her fur was sticky around the rear. "Diarrhea," Renee confirmed. "Likely parasites. We'll confirm once we get a fecal sample." Micah looked over at Henry. "You okay?" Henry nodded, though his throat was tight. "Y'all don't mess around." Micah gave a half smile. "They don't get second chances. So we don't either." At some point, Mira and her team disappeared for a brief break, and Henry stepped closer to the incubator. He didn't touch the glass, didn't speak, just stood there. They looked so small, so impossibly fragile. He could still feel the imprint of their weight on his jacket, weight that had felt more like a memory than a living thing. A movement caught his eye. Echo 17 shifted, barely, then gave a tiny exhale. A vibration traveled through her chest, a shiver, a hiccup. Maybe the beginning of a purr. Henry's hand twitched. He looked away, coughed once, then cleared his throat. His eyes burned from the overhead lights. That's all it was, just lights. When Mira returned, she was wearing something strange. A leafy hood that hung down to her shoulders, made of green burlap and artificial foliage. She looked like she'd stepped out of a homemade swamp monster movie. Micah followed suit with a similar head cover. Renee pulled hers on last. "What in the world?" Henry muttered. Mira adjusted her hood and looked at him through the mesh slit over her eyes. "We're ghosts now." Henry blinked. "Ghosts? If they see our faces, if they associate our scent, our voice, our hands with food or warmth, they lose their wildness. They imprint on humans. And if that happens, we can't ever let them go." Henry digested that. "So you're telling me you gotta pretend not to exist?" She nodded. "Exactly. We're not caregivers. We're wind, tree branches, shadows. They should grow up thinking they were raised by nobody." Henry gave a low whistle. "That's gotta be hard." "It is," she said, "but it's the only way they get to go home." He stared at her for a moment, then glanced back at the incubator. "Seems like they already belong to someplace," he said quietly. Mira looked at him, her voice muffled under the camo hood. "Then it's our job to remind them." That night, Henry drove back to his cabin in Vale. The heater was on full blast, but the seat next to him felt empty in a way that surprised him. He'd never raised kittens, never even had a cat. But the image of that trembling little paw twitching against his chest, it stayed with him. So did the words. They don't get second chances. He knew what that meant. He'd seen it in war, in family, in friends. But maybe, just maybe, this time was different. Maybe this time, 2 lives were about to rewrite the rules. For 3 days, the Bobcat Kittens floated in that fragile space between life and death. Not awake, not asleep, not truly present. Like leaves caught in the shallow eddies of a dry riverbed, too weak to move, but too stubborn to sink. Inside the Wildlife Center's ICU, the world shrank to their needs. Every few hours, a staff member, always dressed in ghostly camouflage, would enter the red-lit room and perform the same careful ritual. Warm the formula, measure vitals, administer fluids, comb out more parasites, check stools, adjust the incubator's humidity, record every flicker of improvement, every drop of decline. Mira had warned her team not to get too invested. Wild doesn't mean cute, she reminded them. Wild means unforgiving. These kittens don't need love, they need precision. But no matter how clinical her words, her hands told a different story. She combed Flint's matted tail with such delicacy, it was as if she were untangling a violin string. When Echo spasmed during a tube feed, she whispered reassurances through the mesh of her hood. Not words exactly, but tones, low and steady, sound without identity. By day 3, Echo's temperature had stabilized. She had urinated on her own. Her breathing had improved, but she hadn't moved. Until 7:03 a.m. on the 4th day. Micah was on shift. He'd just checked the milk warmer and was prepping the tubing kit when he looked up at the monitor and stopped breathing. Echo's head was up. Not fully, not strong, but up. She was craning, just slightly, toward the tiny hole where food usually came through. Her neck trembled from the effort. Her eyes, still too pale, too unfocused, were following the smell of the formula. He called out softly but sharply, "Doc!" Mira came in from the back lab, still pulling on gloves. She followed his eyes to the camera and dropped into a crouch beside the incubator. "Let's try." Micah opened the plexi door and gently offered the bottle. It was barely the size of his thumb, the nipple rubbery and firm, scented with a trace of goat milk and liver broth. Echo sniffed. She opened her mouth once, closed it. Then, on the second try, she latched. Not perfectly, not for long, but it was instinct, buried, fragile, flickering back to life. Micah looked up. "That counts, right?" Mira gave the barest smile. "That's survival, on its feet." Later that same day, Flint stirred for the first time. She didn't feed, not yet. But she tracked movement with her eyes and reacted to warmth. When Renee changed the bedding under her, she curled instinctively to preserve body heat. It was a tiny thing, but it meant her body remembered what it meant to stay alive. By the end of the week, tube feeding had transitioned to bottle feeding. Slowly, awkwardly. Flint was a slower learner than her sister. But Echo set the pace. Every time she fed, her movements became stronger. Her paws began to knead. Her tail gave lazy flicks of protest when handled. "She's got fire," Micah said. "You can see it starting." Henry did see it, on the camera feed. He'd returned to the center that Sunday, unannounced, but not unexpected. Mira had left a chair in the monitor room, just in case. "You said no faces," he muttered, settling into the seat. "But y'all got these things rigged up like the Pentagon." Renee smirked under her hood. "We monitor 24/7. They don't see us, but we see everything." Henry stared at the grainy black and white image on the screen. Two tiny shapes, a fleece pad, a shallow water dish. Echo rolled onto her side and batted lazily at a leaf-shaped toy dangling from a string. "They're starting to act like, well, like kittens." "They're starting to act like themselves," Mira corrected. "That's different." He sipped from the coffee they'd quietly started leaving for him on Sundays. No one mentioned it. No one said thank you. It was just there. "Got names for 'em yet?" he asked. "Nope," said Micah. "Just Echo and Flint. Unit tags." "They act different?" "Totally," Mira said. "Echo's the pouncer. Brave, reckless. First to explore, first to fall off something. Flint's quiet, observant. She waits, plans." Henry nodded slowly. "They're sisters, all right." By the end of week 2, the incubator was no longer needed. The kittens were moved to a recovery enclosure, a 6-by-6-foot indoor space lined with wood shavings, low branches, and hollow logs. Here, they learned to walk without slipping, to climb without falling, to stalk, to hiss, to chase. Mira watched them on the internal feed, her hands crossed behind her back. "They're starting to train themselves," she said. "Train?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "To do what?" "To be bobcats," she replied. "Real ones." Micah grinned under his hood. "They've got a game now. One of them hides behind the log. The other tries to sneak up. It's deadly serious. Until one falls over." Henry chuckled. "Ain't that the way of things?" But even he could see it. Something primal was waking up inside them. Their movements were no longer clumsy, their hisses sharper, their reactions quicker, and their bodies fuller, almost too full. That observation would come soon enough. But for now, Henry just sat in the room with the screens, quietly watching as 2 lives he'd once thought lost began to rise like smoke from ash. No names, No promises. Just two bobcats finding their way back to the wild. The kittens were thriving. By week 4, the staff at Blue Basin Wildlife Center had begun to shift from hope to confidence. Echo and Flint were eating whole prey now. Thawed mice and quail chicks prepared behind thick screens, never delivered by hand. They stalked their meals with increasingly precise coordination, sometimes trading roles mid-pounce. One chasing the scent, while the other ambushed from a log above. They were stealthy, fast, alert, and round, too round. It started subtly. A soft bulge in Echo's middle that Mira assumed was just post-feeding fullness. But then the numbers on the weight chart crept steadily upward. 17% above target, Renee muttered, frowning as she tapped the scale data into the system. Micah raised an eyebrow. That can't be right. It is, Mira said, pulling up the logs. And it's not just fat. Their caloric intake is too high for their activity level. They're lounging more, playing less aggressively, sleeping after meals. Micah glanced at the enclosure feed. On screen, Flint was curled in the sun, one paw thrown over her eyes. Echo was stretched out on her side, gently pawing at a moth, not catching it, just playing. Is it really a problem? He asked. They're still active. They've got skills. They're not domestic cats. No, Mira said slowly, but they're not wild ones yet either. That was the twist, the one no one wanted to say aloud. They'd saved the kittens from death, nursed them back with care, precision, and warmth. And now, that same care was putting them at risk. Later that day, Mira called a staff meeting. They sat in the rear lab, surrounded by charts, monitors, and the soft hum of cooling fans. They're not candidates for release, she said bluntly. Not yet. The words hit like a cold wind. They're too heavy. They're not conditioning properly. In the wild, a bobcat has to burn calories every day, travel miles to hunt, climb, hide, escape. We've given them comfort, security, food in predictable places, warmth without effort. They've adapted, but not to the right environment. Renee looked down at her clipboard. If we put them out there like this, they'd be slow, vulnerable. Their instincts are good, but dulled. Prey would outrun them. Predators would catch them. They wouldn't last a week. A long silence followed. Then Micah spoke. We can't just wait it out, right? Lower their food, get them to drop weight? Mira shook her head. Starving them in a confined space would create stress behaviors. It'd damage trust. It might push them into aggression or apathy. That's not wild. That's trauma. Henry was sitting in the corner. They hadn't asked him to leave. He hadn't offered. So what do we do? He asked softly. Mira turned to him. We need to make their lives harder. He blinked. Come again? She stood and pointed at a large blueprint on the wall, a recent addition to the center's expansion plans. A 1/3 acre outdoor reconditioning zone. Real terrain, elevation, rocks, brush, live scent trails. No flat surfaces, no feeding bowls. Everything hidden, everything earned. It's not finished yet, Micah said. It will be, Mira said. We move them in 2 weeks. That gives us time to prep the habitat. Simulate a lean season. Make them chase every bite. Make them work for water. Make them need their muscles. Henry scratched his beard. You're going to turn it into Bobcat boot camp. Exactly. He let out a quiet chuckle. 2 weeks later, under a gray morning sky, the move began. Echo and Flint were no longer passive. They didn't mule or flinch. They fought, spat, hissed, snarled. Their crates shook with the force of their protests. Micah grinned behind his mesh mask. They're mad. They should be, Mira said. That's wild talking. The new enclosure had no soft corners. The ground was uneven, sloped upward toward a rocky bluff at the back. Brush piles, dry logs, and a complex nest of scent tunnels lined the space. Dead mice had been dragged through the dirt and hidden beneath stones. Fresh feathers were tucked behind bark. This wasn't a pen. It was a maze, a battlefield. When the crate doors opened, the bobcats didn't hesitate. They bolted. Two blurs of gold and black tore across the scrub, vanishing into the bramble with the grace of something reborn. Then, silence. Not a sound for 2 days. Henry returned that weekend. He stood beside Mira, watching the live feed from the motion-triggered cameras. Mostly they showed empty brush and wind-blown sage. Once or twice, a flick of movement. Then, early on the 3rd morning, the first real image appeared. Echo crouched low behind a boulder, her shoulders shifting subtly as she stalked a mouse scent. She moved with purpose, controlled, alert. No belly drag, no lazy swats. She was leaner already. Later that day, Flint was spotted on the upper ridge, balancing with ease on a slanted log. She froze, ears sharp, then darted into the underbrush so fast the camera barely caught it. Micah looked up from the feed. "They're hunting again," Renee nodded. "The instinct's still there. It just needed space." Mira crossed her arms, eyes fixed on the screen. "They needed resistance," she murmured. "And now they have it." Henry didn't say much. Just sipped his coffee, quiet as always. But in the reflection of the monitor, you could see the corner of his mouth lift, just slightly, because he saw it too. They weren't kittens anymore. They were bobcats, and they were coming back to themselves. By early October, the Blue Basin team knew what the numbers said, and what the cameras confirmed. The bobcats weren't just surviving anymore. They were thriving. Their bodies had shed the softness of comfort. What remained were clean lines of muscle, taut energy beneath dappled coats that rippled as they moved. Every pounce was faster, every stalk lower, every movement sharper. But before Mira would even consider opening the release file, they had to face the ultimate test. Live prey. Micah had named it the vanishing point. "You don't release bobcats," he liked to say. "You disappear into their rear-view mirror." Mira stood before the observation team, laser pointer in hand, tracing the outline of the new trial on a satellite photo of the enclosure. "We're using a snowshoe hare. High speed, unpredictable, big enough to challenge them. If they hesitate, if they stalk too long, if they miss and give up, we pull the test. No trauma, no panic." Renee raised an eyebrow. "And if they pass?" Mira looked up. "Then we're ready." The morning was cold. Frost clung to the grass in silver lace. Overhead, a hawk circled far above the training zone. The air had that brittle smell of dry pine and sun-warmed stone. Inside the enclosure, Echo and Flint paced along the edge of the bluff, their movements restless, expectant. They knew something was coming. From behind the outer fence, Henry leaned in toward the monitor. "She's twitching," he said, nodding toward Echo. Micah nodded. "She always does that before she locks in." Renee carefully opened the transport crate. The hare, healthy, fast, trembling, bolted into the enclosure, vanishing into the brush. A heartbeat later, the bobcats went silent. Echo froze. Flint dropped low. No hissing, no posturing, just focus. For the first time, they didn't behave like kittens. Not even trained ones. They behaved like predators. Echo moved first. She didn't chase, she flanked. Took the low ground, circled wide. Flint mirrored her from above, slinking through a nest of dry sticks. They communicated in stillness, pausing, shifting, rebalancing. The hare emerged from a pile of leaves and darted toward the far rocks. The bobcats exploded. 2 streaks of fury. One from above, one from below. Echo reached it first. Her body twisted mid-leap, forepaws out, claws extended. The screen flickered. A blur. Then silence. On the next camera, both bobcats crouched over the kill. Neither played with it. Neither lingered. They ate quickly, methodically, their ears twitching with every rustle of wind. Micah exhaled. "That's it." Mira didn't smile, but her eyes said everything. "They're ready." The next morning, Mira made the call. Henry answered on the second ring, halfway through brewing a pot of bitter truck stop coffee in his cabin's tiny kitchen. "Mr. Maddox?" she said. "It's Dr. Tran." He straightened instinctively. "Everything okay?" There was a pause, and then, "They're going home." His hand tightened around the mug handle. "You serious?" "We're releasing them tomorrow. Back where you found them, or as close as we can. I thought you might want to be there." Henry didn't speak for a moment. His throat tightened. Then he cleared it roughly. "You damn right I do." The release site was miles away from the rest stop. Far enough from highways, but still close to their original range. BLM land. Untouched. Rolling terrain dotted with pine clusters, sagebrush, and sun-bleached stone. The morning was clear, cold, but glowing. Mira and her team arrived in 2 trucks. In the back, 2 reinforced transport crates. Inside, Echo and Flint were calm. Not sedated, just waiting. Micah adjusted the camera on the tripod. Renee held a clipboard with tracking data, tags, coordinates. A soft breeze rattled the dry grass. And then Henry stepped out of his truck. He was wearing the same denim jacket from that day in May. Cleaner now, faded at the seams. Mira walked over to him. Her face was uncovered. No hood, no veil. "They remember?" he asked. "Not us," she said. "Not our faces. But maybe they'll remember the land." Together, they walked to the edge of the clearing. The crates were positioned facing the open hills. Mira gave the signal. Renee unlocked the latches. The doors sprang open. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, Echo emerged. Slow, cautious, ears twitching. She stood in the sunlight, her coat shimmering like bronze and ash. Her eyes scanned the terrain. Her body held still. Flint followed, stepping beside her. She didn't touch her sister, but they were close. So close their whiskers brushed. They didn't bolt. They watched. And then, just as suddenly, babaufi, they moved. No sound, no trail. They slipped into the brush, into the hills, into the land that had once almost forgotten them. In seconds they were gone. Henry stared after them, the wind tugging at the hem of his jacket. No tears, just breath, full deep breath. He didn't say much that day, but that night, back in his quiet cabin, he hung the jacket back on its hook. It smelled like sage now, like road dust, like something else, too, like purpose. And in the morning, the silence in his house didn't feel quite so heavy. Because somewhere out there, in the golden hills and shadowed canyons of eastern Oregon, 2 bobcats were living the wild lives they were born for. And he had helped them get there.